So this is a very important part of the experience. But there's no, there's no understanding of the syndrome of the golden cage, because if you have a great and like high-tech, last generation airport with incredible innovation. You're going to a great hotel that has everything suitable for you. But if there's no accessible transportation, a cab that would take you to one place to another, if people at this crazy accessible hotel have not been trained to attend to the clients with different access requirements, if there is no museum that you can enter, if the beach is in front of the hotel, but there is no way for you to access the beach because there are 360 square stairs. So this is a golden cage syndrome that is a totally no-go for accessible travel.
Welcome to Sustainable Futures with Daniela Bas, where innovation meets impact. Join me every first and the third Saturday at 10 a.m. Central European Time for engaging conversations with visionaries reshaping industries like fashion, tech, tourism, sports, and more through social fairness and sustainability. As a global leader and change maker, I share fresh insights and actionable ideas to inspire meaningful change and drive results. Tune in, subscribe, and help shape a brighter, sustainable future. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, in whichever part of the world you are. Well, travel with me today, because our guest is a very special one who really travels the world. And I'm talking about Igor Stefanovic, who is an incredible gentleman, a very amazing story, personal and also professional. And I had the pleasure to meet him whenever we were attending conferences, and not only. And I discovered an incredible human being. So, hello, Igor.
Hello, Daniela. How are you? Thank you for having me.
You're most welcome, Igor. I have my jolly question for you. Let's start with that. And then later on, I will introduce you to our audience more in detail. So let's talk about numbers, but with a twist.
Mm-hmm.
If inclusive tourism were a stock, would you bet your savings on it? And later on, I have another question.
Well, definitely, I would do that because the odds are that the population is aging, that people have better health because of the medical health care and wellness and even social inclusion. Because if the visibility of people with disabilities and seniors has been increasing in the last 20, 30 years, that's where my consciousness goes back when I started analyzing the society. And when I compare it to the society that I see nowadays, where maybe in 10 minutes or half an hour, I see people of different shapes, sizes, and abilities enjoying their coffee, enjoying their gin tonic, going to the theater, traveling, catching a plane. I would definitely invest my money in that.
You mentioned something that really triggers in me another question. Have you ever visited a destination that really nailed accessibility so well, it left you thinking, now, this is how it should be. It should be done everywhere.
Well, I would say that it's difficult to compare one destination to another because the orography, the landscape is different, the culture is different, because very often we have cultural issues when it comes to attitudes or even cultural barriers. And it's not always the same in all cultures how people with disabilities are being perceived in terms of whether they're being empowered to take their own decisions, or even if they need help or need to be assisted at all times. So I think it's a very cultural issue. But I would say that in the Mediterranean, at least on the European side, there are quite a few destinations that can really lead the way. And I'm not promoting any of them exclusively, but I personally travel very often to Malaga, where I think that there has been a lot of public refurbishment, restoration in the last years. And I just feel in Malaga, because I have an acquired disability and I saw Malaga 20 years ago how it was and how it is looking now. And I would really say that I feel totally independent there. And I would say that's an inclusive place to be. And of course, the one of the reasons is the way the coast approaches the city. There are a lot of things that have to do with the landscape, but there is a public commitment and public investment, and also working with persons with disabilities and their associations and the private sector. So this would be a place where I could say things are done in a good way and people can function independently, enjoy their life.
Thank you. Well, I recently visited Malaga. It's in Spain, by the way, for those
Yeah,
who might
for
have
other,
some
yes.
difficulties with the geography.
Yeah.
And indeed, being a wheelchair user myself, besides being a tourist and a voyager, I noticed that Malaga, at least the historic part of Malaga, and around the center is quite accessible for wheelchair users, and not only, but also parents with the small kids or people who might have a temporary reduced mobility. I noticed that there are many facilities, and it's very easy to move around. Even, if I may say, the use of public toilets, which is
Hmm.
necessary if you are a tourist visiting, most
Yeah.
of them in museums, and not only, are fully accessible and inclusive. So, well, let me share a teeny bit more about you now. Well, Igor Stefanovic, once a young peacekeeper in the Balkans, in his native Bosnia Herzegovina, Igor Stefanovic found his true mission in making tourism inclusive after moving to Spain, where you are right now. Joining the UN, the United Nations World Tourism, I think in 2007, you championed accessibility, crafting global guidelines, policies, and standards. And Igor's work empowers destinations and companies to welcome all. So, with passion and expertise, you really transform the travel into a universal right, not a privilege, shaping a more inclusive future and a more competitive tourism industry. Did I miss something?
Well, I feel very humbled for someone to say these words because you know yourself, you were a public servant in the UN system for so many years. So we never consider ourselves as experts. We always think that we are trying to make the world a better place. I know it sounds a bit phony, what the Americans would say, but when you're deeply convinced about something, you don't really consider yourself as being an expert. You're just pushing an agenda with data, with arguments, with logical reasoning behind it, and you just see that the society or the private sector or the governments are buying in that because they're seeing the same thing as you do. So thank you for introducing me that way, but I'm just thinking, for me, it's a common sense, but thank you if you perceive me in that way. I'm humbled by your
Uh,
words.
Well, I do, because you have gained lots of experience in your work. So, whenever we share expertise, we are experts. Allow me to say that now that
Thank
I'm
you.
not in the system
Perfect.
any longer. So, despite increasing awareness, Igor, accessibility in tourism is often an afterthought rather than a priority. Still, it's moving forward in the right direction, but we're still there. So, what systemic changes are needed to ensure inclusivity becomes a standard practice?
Well, when we think about accessibility, we often think about built environments because this is something, the easiest thing to illustrate to people who need to invest and also to the governments. So any new construction, according to most of new advanced legislations, has to be made more accessible, and old buildings have to be refurbished and adapted. But there are always loopholes when it comes to ticking the boxes because we come to the same problem because if you're only ticking the boxes as an architect or a constructor because you have been hired to execute uh, construction work within the tourism value chain. When I say tourism value chain, that means everything that is included in tourism and travel experience. If you're only ticking the boxes, you're always missing out on the details because accessibility has to do a lot about little technical details and consulting the end users who are really going to be the beneficiaries of everything that is made accessible. If you don't do that, you're missing the point because you're coming to the same problem. You can get a permit to operate, but it doesn't mean that the thing is fully accessible because there are always details that go beyond ticking the boxes. And we often think about legislation as a panacea, but sanctions are not the only way to inspire people to do things because there are economic incentives. People need to count on specific knowledge of experts who need to advise them on what to do. And the business case. The business case is a game changer because if people see the numbers, if people see their own families and entourage and how people live and how lives can evolve and go backwards, but you still get back on your one foot, in my case, because I lost one. So you just realize that this is something that needs to be done. So when people are correcting the mistakes, as an afterthought, after the accessibility has been, I would say, forgotten or maybe done in a superficial way, it's usually to get a permit because they need to comply with the legislation. It's to respond to social visibility because the constructors or the countries or the destinations see themselves that things need to change because they're surrounded by people of all different walks of life for those who can walk. And also, people are different, as I said, shapes and sizes because we just come in different packaging. And also the lost economic opportunity, because I would say that's the main reason for making tourism more accessible. Because if we speak to the companies, if we only come with a human rights cause, very often they won't understand our message. But if we give them the numbers and we analyze the society and how much tourism engaging with people with disabilities, specific access requirements, and seniors would bring in terms of revenues, then they really realize how much they have lost for not having thought of accessible tourism at the very beginning. Because it's much cheaper to do it from the very beginning and the planning phase than correcting the mistakes afterwards, because that is much more expensive.
Well, indeed, we live in the world where the word sustainability now is not only fashionable but needed. And if we want to have a sustainable tourism, looking at the new configuration of the contemporary world in terms of demographics and more, also the use of technologies applied and artificial intelligence applied to tourism. If we want tourism to be sustainable and for all, indeed, we have to look at the social dimension of sustainability, the economic dimension, and the environmental. And all of this is embraced by tourism. Usability is another very important thing that whenever we construct or even refurbish a place from a restaurant to a hotel or an airplane and so on and so forth. All of this has really to be usable, not enough to get access to a place, but then you have to be able to use whatever is made available there. So can you share an example of destinations or businesses that have been measurable and in terms of financial success by making travel truly accessible for all, Igor, in your experience?
Well, there are many destinations around the world, and those who are just kind of waking up now because the development has been coming lately in different forms. And I would say that, of course, that traditionally in the most developed economies, such as Europe, North America, Japan, and Australia, of course, these countries started working on accessibility maybe a few decades ago. I myself live in Spain, that is a very, very inclusive society. And Southern Europe, I find it very often, because of the attitude of people, even friendlier and more inclusive and accessible than other regions of the world, because it has to do also with the hospitable mentality. Because in some countries, you can make the infrastructure, the services, the quality of the service much at a much higher level. But if people are not hospitable and ready to help you or answer your questions, then it's changing the whole picture. I think it's extremely important without really pinpointing at certain destinations. I will
Hmm.
say some numbers at the end of this whole conversation because I do have some statistics from some countries, because very few of them are really following up on data when it comes to accessible tourism. And there are many complex issues when it comes to quantifying things in accessibility. The same goes for tourism because it's such a complex sector with so many activities. But first of all, the destinations realize those that have done a good job and the companies that have done a good job, usually they realize there's a larger talent pool when it comes to hiring employees with accessibility, access needs, and also getting new customers. It's also about enhanced innovation, competitiveness, and service quality. As I said before, it's about extended tourism seasons because we live in the Mediterranean, but there are so many destinations around the world that have a seasonality problem. Hotels very often close 1st of October and open after the Easter break or before the Easter break. But if we had our capacities occupied by many more clients throughout the year, there would be more career prospects for people with disabilities. We would be attracting more customers. We would be generating revenue year round. And the multiplier effect, because if every person with disability usually travels accompanied by two to three other people, we are talking a huge multiplier effect. Just for those people who are not working in tourism, multiplier effect in economic terms in tourism means that you stay at a hotel, but you eat at a restaurant, you go to the museum, you go to an attraction, amusement park, you catch a plane, you're using local taxi, you're consuming local food, you're enjoying the local culture. This is all multiplier effect. And if you have a person being accompanied by two to three other people, that's a big multiplier effect. And of course, it's also better destination reputation and better corporate social responsibility records for the company. So there are many causes and business cases that successful destinations and companies have already realized. So it's really about seeing what's working for others, for those who are just starting, because it's not reinventing the wheel. You need to adapt things to your own reality, but you should just realize what other destinations or companies are good at. So you would follow their path because they're just lessons learned. And it's just about talking to people who are doing a good job.
So imagine the perfect accessible travel experience from airport to hotel to attractions. In your view, what would it look like and how close are we to achieving it, Igor?
Well, I would just say that the perfect travel experience for a person with disability is a personal thing because very often the sector or the society wants to put all of us who have some kind of disability in the same pool of people, but we are not the same pool of clients and customers. We all have specific access requirements, but there are some generalities, let's say some general features, because first of all, there needs to be enough information for the clients to decide whether this or that part of the travel experience works for them. I should never trust the companies that say in their accessibility statement, we are 100% accessible. That doesn't exist. Something that's accessible for you is not maybe something that is suitable for me. First of all, we need to collect and provide the right information. The clients collect the information, make their decisions and choices, but the destinations and companies need to provide information. And then we all need to know about our responsibilities when and what kind of questions we are supposed to ask to the service provider. But a perfect travel experience means like having no hurdles and no obstacles, that is diminishing our frustration when we travel, that is diminishing complaints, and that is also making us realize that we are having a blast, that we are having the best experience of our lifetime. That
If I
means,
if I
yes,
may,
please.
Igor, it also means to save energy because then the energy that you have can be used really to enjoy the travel experience. So sorry if I interrupted you.
Yes, because all the questions that you're making, the answers that you need to interpret, and back and forth, because none of us is a control maniac because we have a disability, but we just want to make sure that we won't get hurt and we won't be suffering during the vacation that we are paying for. So that's the main issue. And we are paying the same as other clients, and if we travel accompanied, and very often if we go to higher categories of hotels because we know we have more commodities, we are paying even more money. So this is a very important part of the experience. But still there's no understanding of the syndrome of the golden cage, because if you have a great and like high tech, last generation airport with incredible innovation. You're going to a great hotel that has everything suitable for you. But if there's no accessible transportation, a cab that would take you to one place to another, if people at this crazy accessible hotel have not been trained to attend to the clients with different access requirements, if there is no museum that you can enter, if the beach is in front of the hotel, but there is no way for you to access the beach because there are 360 square stairs. So this is a golden cage syndrome that is a totally no-go for accessible travel. So if you're going to a destination, you as a customer with a disability, you would understand that there are 10 beaches and one of them is accessible, but you will go to that beach. There are 10 museums, but two of them you can access because others are towers from the 13th century, and maybe you won't be able to climb them because there is no elevator inside. But maybe some of them have already installed the elevator because there was an architecture, archaeological research before on how things can be done. So you can have maybe a list of 10, 15 things on your bucket list of what you want to do, and then at the end, you have a seamless travel experience. And you come back home with a great gut feeling saying, oh, I had a great time. And I did not get frustrated at all because everything that I was informed about was a trustworthy information, and it proved to be okay. And it proved to be really something that I was looking for. So, this is really the reaction that a traveler with disability should have once he or she comes back to their place of residence.
Igor, you already mentioned it, but I will reformulate the question and maybe we can add some details. Is inclusive tourism just a buzzword for most companies? Or are we seeing real structural change, and who is leading and who is pretending?
Well, sometimes I need to be ironic about this question because if you go to a hotel that says we are sustainable and the only sustainability action is like don't throw the towel on the floor if you only took a shower twice and there's nothing else that they're doing. And the same would be for the hotel or destination saying we treat all the clients equally, everybody matters the same to us. If there is that statement and there is nothing that can be shown as real action and how the actions are being upgraded and upscaled so your services would be better, I would say this would be accessibility washing. Because if you're only doing that also for the sake of CSR reports because you're obliged by the stock exchange or by legislation because of the size of your company to report on your CSR boxes, and this is only a report with beautiful pictures of people with disability smiling, and there is really nothing behind it. So there's just kind of a cartoon. I would say that this exists, but I would also say that there are some really admirable cases of big shots and small shots when it comes to tourism brands and destinations. We had a case, for example, of some Indian destinations that got recognized for their accessibility records when nobody would think of going to India for accessibility. And I would say that there are some small destinations in the world in emerging economies that are doing a great job. And there are also small and big shots when it comes to brands. Not all the big chains that have a strong corporate policy and that are kind of under scrutiny of the general public and the customer pool are the ones who are making accessibility improvements, because the stereotype is you only go to a five-star hotel and everything is impeccable there. Yeah. So this is not true either, because there are some small family-run hotels whereas there's a vision of a couple that is running the hotel or the family that is running the business. And even though they have 30 or 40 rooms, they can make great accessibility scores and they can make and provide a great accessible experience to their clients. So it doesn't have to be always big shots. And I would also say that there are some great examples of companies that started as a social enterprise. In Spain, there is, for example, the chain Ilunion Hotels. They have 70% of their workforce with some kind of disability, and they cater to any kind of specific access requirement. And for example, in India, the other corner of the world, we have lemon tree hotels that have labor inclusion in every single segment of the society, where they employ people with different disabilities, with cognitive disabilities, physical disabilities, where they think of, for example, people who were working in the streets in different activities that would damage their own integrity, but they wanted to get out of that and they wanted to be included in the labor in the workforce of the tourism industry. For example, there are incredible cases of smaller chains and smaller companies that don't have necessarily five-star hotels, but they're doing an incredible job when it comes to accessibility. But there are still those that we said are doing some inclusivity washing, and that they need to maybe show more results that could be demonstrated to the public on what's being done.
So this triggers in me another question. If accessibility laws were as strict in tourism as they are in aviation safety, how different would the industry look like today?
Well, that's a good question because whenever we think about rules and standards, we think about these standards and rules being included in the legislation because legislation needs to be later on provided through regulatory framework. Because if you have a legislation alone and there is no regulatory framework, there are no standards, there is no compliance scheme, there are no incentives, there is no mandatory training to implement the legislation, then the legislation is only a paper that you adopt in a parliament and it doesn't go anywhere. So the airline industry is something specific because an airplane is like a vessel. It's like an object that has its own dimensions, its own features. You can have different manufacturers, but an airplane has pretty much defined its function, how it looks like, and what is it for, and also the dimensions. More or less the airports that you need to get on board. But the tourism sector, to have a proper legislation in accessible tourism, you have to think about maybe 20 different sectors that feed in the tourism experience, that are part of tourism, and maybe 10 different ministries in a government that have to deal with different chunks, different links of the value chain. So the standard on ISO on accessible tourism that we worked on for 5 years, that is the first comprehensive standard on accessible tourism and that encompasses the whole value chain. If we would imagine that standard that encompasses the whole value chain of the tourism experience, if we would translate that into a law, that would be a perfect law. But then every country would have their own tweaks and details why a universal law on accessible tourism is hard to adopt. And I know in Italy there is a very positive movement now to come up with a law on accessible tourism that is kind of, I would just say, development extravaganza in positive terms because there are not too many specific accessible tourism laws in the world because there is normally legislation on accessibility as a thing that has to do with access to built environment, to digital services, to other spheres of life, and then tourism is part of it. Then, on the other hand, there are laws on tourism where accessibility is only mentioned as one of 360 elements. But if the perfect case scenario would be adopting a specific law on accessible tourism, I would say that this would be something that we would need to do. But I'm just saying that it's not the same as the airline industry because it's very specific. So tourism would have more challenges, but still we need to start from somewhere. We can't justify ourselves all the time that law is not the only answer. But I wouldn't say that the sanctions for not complying with the law would be the only way to go around because people would find a way to evade themselves from complying. So there would always be the ways for you to tick the box and just kind of put it under the carpet, and then you would find the mistakes afterwards.
I think that we do have the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, with some articles that can help making tourism and culture and leisure activities more accessible, usable, and inclusive, therefore. We do have the 2030 agenda and the sustainable development goals that also are a kind of a guideline, if you wish. The universal design is also in place. So even though there are national legislations in place, they can benefit of these treaties so to make tourism inclusive.
Yeah, that's a good point, Daniela, when we think about the governments that have the mandate to legislate. But I often encounter a challenge with the private sector
Mm.
because only the big companies discuss SDGs and the 2020-30 Agenda for Sustainable Development. But most of companies in the tourism sector, 70%, in some countries up to 85, 90%, are small and medium sized companies, and very often micro sized companies. And they don't want the story about SDGs because they're very small. They just want to know how can they improve their service and how can they make more money at the end because they're just employing 20 people. So it's also a challenge for us from international agencies like the United Nations how to reach the ground, how to reach the customers, and how to reach those who are running a small and medium sized company. And it's very challenging how to go towards the same objective, but you're changing the communication and the way you're talking to these stakeholders. So I think this is also challenging for us who have international background to kind of lower down the criteria when we speak to different stakeholders. And you know yourself, you're a journalist, that's your background. And it's challenging when you work for international organizations. But I think we are getting there because I see that the buy in of the tourism industry towards accessibility is not a hot topic only in developed destinations, what we say in tourism, mature destinations that have started long time ago, but in many, many emerging destinations as well. Because they're just realizing, because according to UNDESA data, the population aging is not only happening in the most developed industrialized world, it's happening in most of the countries of the world. Even though we would think that natality is something that characterizes developing countries, but population aging and the buy-in of accessibility is happening in across the globe. It's not only in developed economies.
And you mentioned communication. So, what are we using right now to communicate this conversation we're having to others? Media or media. I think that this could be another way of reaching the small companies you were mentioning, providing through media, through documentaries, through infotainment,
Yes,
um,
and social media as well. They have a huge
and social
potential
media, right?
because how many you were working on sports as well, and how many people who participated in Paralympics in Paris got famous because there was
Yes.
so much attention paid to Paralympics. Because myself, I haven't paid much attention before to Paralympics, but this year, sorry, it was last year, I was following everything that was happening, and all these people became kind of stars on the social media because they were telling their story and they were
Mhm.
showing their success in something they were passionate about. So this is a great potential to tap into when we are talking about social media as well.
Well, now let's talk about the past for a moment and then we move to the present and the future.
Yeah.
So, once upon a time, what moment sparked your passion or an eye opening situation that made you realize the need for a more accessible and ethical tourism industry? Igor.
Thank you. Well, I would say that I'm a cat. I've already spent quite a few lives. So
Yes.
in my previous life, still with me being the same person with the same face, I did not have any disability, and I started working in ethical, inclusive, and accessible tourism from the very beginning at UN Tourism in 2007. And it was my moral and ethical conviction that led me through my work and the partners that I met from the civil society first, especially in Spain, the ONCE Foundation, and also at the European level, the European Network on Accessible Tourism, for accessible tourism. And from these partners, I've learned so much. I was working on manuals, on communication, on producing knowledge. But then myself, I had an acquired disability because of a cancer. I got amputated. It was almost 7 years ago. And then I realized that some of the good practices that I was promoting, I started maybe having doubts about details that I did not experience as an end user. I started asking more questions. I started making more complaints when it comes to customer service. I started asking more logical questions to the service providers that they were not able to answer. And you also realize when you're an end user, you get more frustrated because you don't get the answers to your questions very often. And but I've also become more passionate about promoting the business case of accessibility because I myself, I travel alone, I travel with my partner, I travel with my friends, and besides my work, I'm a very passionate traveler. And I would say it's a very personal thing, but I kind of leave most of my salary in restaurants, hotels, and airplanes because that's something that hasn't changed. That means I'm still the same person, but I might have different access requirements when it comes to enjoying my experiences.
I couldn't agree more. I share similar things like you. Now, let's move to the present. Right now, you are at the forefront of shaping policies, as we said, working at the World Tourism Organization that make tourism more inclusive. So, what's the biggest challenge the industry faces today, and what solutions do we see working?
Well, many big companies are obsessed now with so many different frameworks that come to them where they need to measure sustainability,
Yeah.
like ESG framework. We have, for example, MST framework that is measuring sustainable tourism, where we included accessibility under the social dimension. They have their corporate social responsibility reports. They need to report on their sustainability because they're on stock exchange listed company. And I would say that the buy-in of the private sector is still a pending challenge because they're still not realizing how much money they're losing. I would say maybe in 2012, we reached to the number of 1 billion international tourists crossing international borders. And we were saying 1 billion of international tourists, 1 billion of opportunities in the brackets, lost opportunities because we were people with disabilities were counted at 1 billion figure back then. And now we've reached, after the COVID era, 1.4 billion international travelers crossing borders. And we almost have the same number of people with severe disabilities according to WHO. There's still millions of lost opportunities for the private sector. And I would also say that international cooperation, because I've realized very often the destinations in emerging economies, they want to drive the accessibility agenda, but they don't know where to start from. And with all these recent turmoils in the world, international cooperation has been given even less importance where countries need to help each other, where they need to be opposed to each other. So I would always advocate for collaboration because more knowledge brings more social and economic benefits. So I think destinations in emerging economies, the governments and the private sector need the help of those who are leading the way in other economies where accessibility is working in order to really produce this change. So I would say this is also a major challenge. And I would always say don't look at the person with disabilities as those who need your help. Look at the clients who need to enjoy your services, but they need some adaptations in order to be able to fully enjoy what you're offering. So this is something that the business people should have in their mind and their vision of developing their business.
You mentioned that you have some data. You mentioned the 1 billion travelers and 1 billion 400 millions. Are these projections or these are real numbers that have been measured?
These are real numbers. The international arrivals, I would say that is kind of the main part of our brand for decades, since because we are celebrating 50 years this year. UN Tourism, we are the only UN agency with the headquarters in Spain, and we are specialized traditionally in measuring tourism performance. So the number of 1.4 billion international tourists crossing international arrivals are the numbers that are even going to be updated, I would say now in spring. These are real numbers collected from the countries, from the statistics institutions and statistics commissions of different member states. and we have more than 160 member states, so the bulk of the countries of the UN system, of course. But when it comes to accessible tourism, there are no global statistics. There are only estimates of how many people are potential travelers, because it's very complex to measure, because different countries still don't define accessibility in the same way. They still don't define disabilities in the same way, and they still apply different standards. That's why we need different standards. But for example, when it comes to numbers, in 2012, the European Union calculated that 70% of their citizens with disabilities had the economic and physical capacity to travel. And for example, in 2012, residents of the EU with disabilities undertook approximately 170 million overnight trips and the same number of day trips, what we say like excursions in the European slang. And for example, the United States, they have different organizations like Open Doors that are following up on the US market. And in 2024, this is quite recent, the US travelers with disabilities spent nearly $50 billion on travel, and with their companions, altogether $100 billion in 2024. The cruise industry grew at an incredible pace, and the same thing is happening more or less in other countries. For example, 10 years ago, Spain measured that travelers with disabilities would spend 30% more on their trips than people without disabilities. So, this is also an interesting figure that I would say would easily apply to many other Mediterranean and European countries. And Australia is also doing a good job when it comes to calculating things, and also the UK. In Australia, for example, when domestic and international markets are added, the total market of accessible tourism would come up to almost 11 billion Australian dollars. And Visit England, for example, is a very important institution when it comes to economic performance of accessibility. They, for example, reported domestic overnight visitors. That means visitors who come from within the British territory and who spend at least one overnight in a destination, that they spent in 2023 6.7 billion English pounds. So these are only examples from some countries of the world where accessibility in tourism could be measured by surveying the customers, by surveying the business providers, the service providers. But we are aiming towards a very challenging task to have a methodology at the global level where we could go beyond the estimates to actual numbers. So this is something that I would say that's a pending thing on our agenda, and there are still many loopholes that we need to look into on how to define things so everybody speaks the same language when it comes to measuring accessible tourism.
It's a humongous task, but I really hope you are going to achieve it soon. Uh, Talking about tasks that started now but are projected towards the future, like the one you just mentioned. Imagine you are 20 years old in the year 2071.
Yes.
What kind of tourism industry would you want to experience, and what steps must we take today to make that vision a reality?
Well, that would be a holistic and comprehensive vision of destinations that would need to have all pillars of sustainability included, where we have climate change issues a bit curbed and controlled, where we are trying to achieve net zero emissions when it comes to tourism, and where the role of tourism in mitigating the climate change is much, much higher, where economic sustainability and is the one that has social and economic inclusion as part of it, and where accessibility is present in all different pillars of sustainability as a cross-cutting issue, where it's not only a part of social cause for the destinations. And when it comes to design, universal design should be applied everywhere. Universal design can be beautiful, it can be sexy, it can be aesthetically appealing. If things are done in a good way, those who don't have access needs and specific access requirements, they don't even understand when something is accessible if it's done in an appealing way where universal design is functioning. where people who are having a bulky suitcase with them, and I don't know in 2071 what kind of suitcase are we going to bring with us, because we're talking about futuristic
Yes.
prospects, but definitely where people who do not have any visible specific access requirement would be using all the tourism infrastructure products and services under the same terms as people with disabilities, and where we would not distinguish the market of people with and without disabilities, and where destination marketing organizations would be marketing everything that the destination offers for all people, and not having a special web portal for people with specific access requirements. There is often this wording that I hate: those with disabilities. I call it, why don't you apply a principle of egocentric philanthropy? Because you will be on that boat as well. You, your children may be born with cognitive, for example, disability. Your parents will have a disability at the end of their lives. So there should be this vision by 2071 that accessibility has to do with all of us and not with those.
Yes, if all cultural, infrastructural, digital um, infrastructures are inclusive, usable, and accessible, we won't even need to talk anymore about inclusive tourism. It will be tourism for all, and and I like that vision. In conclusion, if you had 60 seconds to pitch a room full of tourism industry leaders on why inclusivity isn't just a moral obligation, but a smart business move, what would you say? 1 minute.
I would say that the population is evolving at all times, and the inclusivity is becoming part of our bread and butter. And that businesses would have to see not only the clients with disabilities as a source of revenue, they should also see themselves and their families reflected in their customers' needs. And for that reason, in order for their businesses to flourish throughout the year in tourism, that is a very seasonal industry in most of destinations, even in urban destinations, while we wouldn't normally think about that, they should think about tourism as something bringing more revenues, bringing more clients, and people speaking better of the business that they're enjoying when they're visiting a destination. They should think about their business reputation that would make their businesses grow, flourish, be inclusive, and reflecting more the realistic picture of the society that they can see out there in the streets when they leave their business and they need to go back home. This is the reason, really, for making businesses more realistic and more connected to the society.
I thank you very much, Ivan Stefanovic from the World Tourism Organization, sharing what's happening in the world in this wonderful industry we both love. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniela. It was a pleasure for me chatting with you.
As I wrap up this episode, my heartfelt gratitude to today's guest and to all of you. Join me for the next episode as we delve deeper with special guests, uncovering thought-provoking insights and actionable steps, paving the way for a brighter, inclusive, sustainable tomorrow. Thanks also to Damian Morton, music, and Maria Cortez Gagliano, social media. Don't miss out next episode on shaping the future we aspire to. Ciao, ciao!